Good afternoon. I'm Jody St. John, and I'm going to be talking about the Violence Against Women Act for my policy analysis. The Violence Against Women Act was originally passed as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. Its intentions were to change the attitudes about domestic violence, to improve services to victims, and really to bring about awareness, as well as change the criminal justice department and the way it handled violence and sex crimes. The background of the violence against women is basically it was due to decades of rising crime rates and especially against women. From around the 1960s, violent crime rose steadily. And in the 1970s, some grassroots organizations began stressing the need for change in attitudes regarding violence against women because up until the 80s, researchers had treated violence against women as a private family matter. And in the 1980s, researchers began to address violence against women issues as well as the public, and they began to view violence as a crime instead of something that was a private family matter. Here in Texas, there is the Texas Council on Family Violence, and just some statistics. It shows that in 2016, 146 women were killed by a male intimate partner, and that another important thing to consider is that 68% of the perpetrators used a firearm to murder their female partner. So, and this is also very important, 39% of the victims are turned away from shelters due to the lack of space. So that's pretty high. And of more than 5 million Texans have experienced domestic violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 Texas women will experience domestic violence. In 1984, Congress enacted the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act, and it was to assist in preventing family violence and to provide shelter to victims as well. In 1994, Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. And it was actually sponsored by then Senator Joe Biden, and he presented it in 1993, but it was actually passed in 1994 and signed into law by Bill Clinton. The shortfalls of just really the legal responses and the need for a change in attitudes towards violence was the primary reasons cited for the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. The second subtitle mandated the establishment of a national hotline. This provides statistical research as well as assistance, and it still exists today. It helped create laws revolving around interstate crime, and this helped to prevent predators from following victims across state lines. Victims were also allowed to testify at pretrial hearings and talk about the danger they would they would be facing if the perpetrator was released prior to their trial date. So oftentimes didn't, they were held until their trial date. In addition to this, the U.S. Postal Service put in place regulations to ensure the confidentiality of domestic violence shelters and victims' addresses. The third subtitle declared that crimes committed on the basis of gender could be considered just like discrimination and to violate the civil rights. However, the victim had to prove it was motivated by gender. So an example would be if while the person was performing the act of violence against the female, he was also stating like hate sentences about females in general. So it was on the victims to have to prove that gender was specifically motivated, that gender motivated the crime. And the seventh subtitle was basically addressing protections for battered immigrant women and children. And so it was basically the country recognizing that immigrant women were also suffering, and they were likely to not come forward about their abuser because of risk and fear of deportation. So these victims were given the opportunity to petition the Attorney General for themselves and their children to avoid deportation, and they had to prove just that it would cause extreme economic hardship. According to, here's some statistics. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, in 2016, Houston had the second highest number of abuse calls placed to them, and also statewide. And Texas is actually the second highest number of calls in the country. So the most reported types of abuse were emotional and verbal, and unfortunately, the attitude is still that emotional abuse isn't as serious as physical or sexual abuse, but it really is, and people are suffering from post-traumatic stress, and it's just as has just as much effect on the victim and their ability to lead a healthy life. The manifest goals were, as I said, to change the attitudes, to improve the legal and criminal justice systems, and to put efforts into prevention and education. Some of the latent goals were that the feds really came down on pro-arrests. So in order to send like a strong message about how domestic violence wasn't going to be tolerated anymore. And the problem was that, of course, this only provided short-term relief, and in some instances, it prevented the woman victim at that time from possibly coming forward, because while they wanted it to stop, they didn't necessarily want the person or the breadwinner to be put in jail. So the policy says it was intended to protect victims, but at the time the victims were really considered women, and you can tell just by the name of the act, and the word women is used throughout. So in 1995, the Office of Violence Against Women was created, and they're the main ones that administer the authorized federal funds, the grants. And then other agencies are the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, so part of the Human Health Services sector, and the Office of Justice Programs in the Department of Justice. The categories of crimes that the grant programs address are domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. The Violence Against Women Act treats each of those as distinct crimes, and data on the crimes are available from two national surveys, the National Crime Victimization Survey and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Uniform Crime Report. The data from the two sources vary, however, because the Uniform Crime Reports describe crimes that have been reported by law enforcement, and the survey data, it describes self-reported crimes that weren't necessarily reported to law enforcement. So there have been several. In 2005, the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act created some more provisions, and it added protections for trafficked foreigners and created the first federal funding for rape crisis centers. It developed culturally and linguistic specific centers for communities. So that was important, and created programs designed to improve the public health response to domestic violence. So within the medical world. And it also enhanced the programs for victims with disabilities, and it broadened the service provisions to include children and teenagers. The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013, Public Law 113-4, reauthorized most of the programs. It consolidated a few, and amended and authorized appropriations for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And it gave tribal authorities to enforce domestic violence laws, even if those crimes were committed against non-Indian individuals. It established non-discrimination provisions, for example, the men and LGBTQ victims, and it included new provisions to address the rape kit backlogs. It also gave colleges more tools for students regarding dating violence and sexual assault. Reauthorizations, and the first one took place. Here are some more statistics, and these are from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports and the have that wrong. And the National Survey, So the rate of what is called intimate partner violence now at this point is declined by 63%. And according to the National Survey data, the intimate partner victimization rates also they vary by age, but showed that females aged 18 and older generally experience the higher rates of intimate partner violence. And another important note is that the rates of interpersonal violence have historically been higher for Black females than white. So moving forward, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2018 has been, it was supposed to expire in September of 2018, but due to the elections, they extended it until 2019, and they're actually supposed to make some decisions December 7th here. So basically, Sheila Jackson Lee proposed it in a bill 6454, and it's going to reauthorize the STOP grants. And authorizes them to develop and enforce firearm surrender policies. It extends the Rape Prevention and Education Grant, reauthorizes the SMART Prevention Program, preserves and expands housing protections for survivors, expands firearm laws to prohibit people convicted of dating violence from possessing firearms, improves responses to missing and murdered Native American women, because that has become a problem and it doesn't get nearly enough attention, and of course protects the Office Against Violence for Women from being de-emphasized, merged, or consolidated. In 2000, and it reauthorized the programs, but it also enhanced the penalties for stalking and domestic violence, and added protections for abused foreign nationals, and created programs for the elderly and disabled people.